Today on the Servant Leadership Podcast, we're honored to have David Iglesias with us to share his journey and insights on leadership, faith, and the intersection of politics and law. David is an accomplished American attorney and is currently the director of the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics in Illinois, where he also serves as the Jean and E. Floyd Kvamme Associate Professor of Politics and Law. David was appointed by President George W. Bush as the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Mexico, serving in this role for 6 years. He's known for his integrity and dedication to justice, exemplifying the principles of servant leadership through his commitment to public service and ethical conduct. In the movie A Few Good Men, Tom Cruise plays a character inspired by David and a case he was a part of involving Marines at Guantanamo Bay. Today, David will share his insights on how faith, integrity, and servant leadership can drive success and foster a more just and compassionate society.
Captain David Iglesias, retired Navy JAG. Tell me a little bit about your career path and how you got here.
Wow, that's one of the biggest questions I've been asked in a very long time. So quickly, born to missionaries in Panama. Lived in Latin America for about 8 years as a child. My father is an indigenous Panamanian, a member of the Kuna tribe, one of the few unconquered tribes in all the Americas. Wow. And my mother was a German-American preacher's kid. Yeah, from Minnesota. So how did they get together? Completely different story, but they got together. 3 months after they met, they got married, and I'm the product of that union. I grew up in the United States and Panama, primarily in New Mexico and a little bit in Oklahoma. Came to Wheaton College as an undergrad. Felt like law was where I was meant to be, and went to law school. I wanted an adventure, not just a job. So I went Navy JAG, and it completely exceeded my wildest expectations. Yeah.
Wow.
So I served 30 years. Of those 30 years, 10 full-time years and then 20 years in the reserves. But I had a ton of different jobs involved in politics in my home state of New Mexico. I've been in the private sector, was a White House fellow, did lots of things. Finally hit the place in my career where I retired in 2014 from the U.S. Navy, where I was doing war crimes prosecutions in Guantanamo. And that's how I ended my career. And then Wheaton College said, we have a center that needs a director. Would you apply?
Wow.
Talked to my wife and prayed about it, talked about it, sweated about it. Thought, on the one hand, go back home, make a lot of money, and get bored out of my mind. On the other hand, earn a lot less money, but make a difference in the lives of a lot of bright young kids. So I've been here for 9 years.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, thank you for your service.
Absolutely.
Really, really appreciate that. As you think through that trajectory, that's not your normal trajectory.
No.
How did your experience early on being a U.S. attorney, how did that actually shape your leadership, what you know about leadership today? Yeah,
so I became U.S. attorney for the District of New Mexico. And just to let you know, the president gets to appoint all 93 United States attorneys. We're confirmed by the Senate. And then our job is to enforce federal law. How many federal laws are there? Who knows? Thousands, at least 30,000. But we focus on maybe the most common, several hundred. My job was to enforce federal law on the border state, because we share 140 miles with the Mexican state of Chihuahua. And also I had 3 military bases, 21 Native American reservations, and virtually half the state was federal because of, national laboratories, forests, parks. People a lot in the Midwest don't understand it, but out west, a lot of the country is federal. Right. So who has to enforce the law and help maintain good order and discipline? It's the U.S. attorney. So I was 43, and I'd already, at that point, spent about 15 years as a Navy JAG, and I learned a lot of really positive lessons. And one was to make sure that my office knew me. So I'd walk around throughout my 6 years there. I'd sit down and talk to an assistant prosecutor, a secretary, a paralegal. Whoever was there, I'd just sit down and have this kind of conversation, because I wanted them to understand that I not only cared about the mission of the Justice Department, but I cared about them.
Wow.
So it's called walkabout management or walkabout leadership.
Yeah. When you started getting into all this, did you realize how in the public eye your career would be?
I had no idea. I really didn't. And you have to remember, generally, it's a pretty quiet 4 to 8 year appointment. Because we have to undergo a really in-depth background investigation. So the FBI investigated me until going back to my 18th birthday. So that was like 25 years of investigation. And I've lived a pretty boring life, which is good for this position, right? And very rarely do U.S. attorneys get in trouble because all those that have anything questionable don't get the nomination. So, yeah, I just figured I'd put in my time and then I would probably run for higher office at some point.
What was that like? I mean, I've seen many interviews with you, and you're on some major news networks throughout your career. What was that like going from...
Unbelievable. I mean, I used to think it was a big deal to be quoted in the Albuquerque Journal, and then the next thing I knew after I got fired was, Meet the Press, and who's the guy who was with CBS News? Dan Rather was on Dan Rather's show. I was all on these shows, and I'm thinking, what blew my mind was when Denmark sent a Danish TV crew, and I said, why is this news in Denmark? And they said, you don't understand. What happens in America affects the world.
Wow.
And that's when I realized what a huge job that I had had.
Wow. That would have been really awesome.
Yeah.
As I think when a lot of people hear your story, they often go to the movie A Few Good Men.
Yeah.
I mean, how many people ask you about that movie?
All the time, which is fine because it was one of these things that happened early in my career. I think that was my second or third court-martial case. I was 27, 28, so I was pretty young. And, we did go to Guantanamo. What really helped me was I was stationed with Lieutenant Debbie Sorkin. If that last name rings a bell, her brother Aaron wrote the screenplay and wrote the play. There were 10 Marines involved. We defended all 10. 7 took the deal from the base, but my client and the 2 others said, we will not take the deal. We were ordered to do the code red and we want to fight this. So we had 3 separate trials. And, I was so taken by this as a 27-year-old lawyer that I thought, I'm going to write a short story about this. And I started. I have the note somewhere. I got 2 pages. I called it Incident at Guantanamo. Never finished it. Sorkin obviously did. And the rest is history.
Wow. Yeah. What was that like? I mean, even just going through the process of hearing, how did you first hear that they're going to make a movie out of part of your life?
So I had friends still in D.C. area. So I left active duty the first time and moved back to New Mexico. And then I got an email from one of my Navy buddies saying, hey, the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. is doing a play called A Few Good Men. It's written by Aaron Sorkin. I thought, Debbie Sorkin must have given her brother the transcripts. Because it's a fascinating case, because the issue was never did they do it. The issue was who ordered it and who should be responsible for this injury. That's what the issue is about. So it completely blew my mind, to use an old-fashioned term.
Yeah, when I recently watched the movie, again, knowing that I was going to talk to you, movies are obviously dramatized. How realistic was the movie? Was it actually like what happened, or is it very dramatized?
Well, in part, yes. So I would say on a scale of 1 to 100, 100 being like the perfect Ken Burns documentary, it was maybe 80.
Oh, wow.
Because there really was a code red. It was in Guantanamo. There was a trial. But the victim actually lived, so major difference there, because in the movie he dies.
Right.
But the names was barely changed. So the victim was Private First Class Willie Santiago in the movie. In the real case, it was Private First Class Willie Alvarado. They took the character played by Kiefer Sutherland. They took the name of one of the female lawyers who defended the Marines and used it. So Lieutenant Kendrick was actually a female Navy JAG. In the movie, wow. Lieutenant Kendrick was the Marine, the hardcore Marine officer, junior officer. Yeah.
Wow. Did the scene happen that everyone can quote a million times when you say, "I want the truth"?
You can't handle this. No, that was completely Aaron Sorkin's genius.
Okay.
Yeah, look, as a junior officer, JAG, you don't scream at a combat-tested Marine colonel and live to tell about it.
Right.
So, no, it was very respectful. But I mean, that just showed you Sorkin's genius in writing just a terrific factual-based movie and play.
Yep. I think even if people haven't seen the movie, everyone has heard that quote. I mean, genius writing.
I heard it was voted one of the top 10 best movie lines of all time.
Yeah, I don't doubt that at all. So thinking through, your career path was amazing to say the least. As you are toward the end of your practicing career, if you will, you ended up having an experience that you probably thought you wouldn't have, leaving the Bush administration,
right?
To some extent, and you wrote a book about it.
I did.
Tell us a little bit about what that was like, how you ended up in this role, and how you ended up out of the role.
Yeah, so I was, let's see, 40. So I got the call on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 2006. So I was like 48 years old. Yeah, I thought I had the world by its tail. And then I get this call from a guy that I knew at the Justice Department. He goes, "Hey, we want to go another way. We really want your resignation." I thought, what? Because I just had my office evaluated and thumbs up. And then I realized, wait a minute, we're political appointees. We serve at the pleasure of the president. But I also remembered that I'd received 2 inappropriate phone calls snooping around about cases we were investigating. So we were investigating the then governor of the state of New Mexico, Philip Richardson, and Senator Pete Domenici, who was at that point, the ranking Republican senator, or the senator, period, of the state, had called me and was snooping around about when I was going to be indicting him. I couldn't answer that question. And then he said the words that haunted him and cost him a lot of legal bills. That was, will it be before the election?
Wow.
Because we cannot rush. It's always been DOJ policy, Justice Department policy, to not file indictments for political effect. Mm-hmm. That's what they do in corrupt little countries, and of which we're not one of those. So I thought back to that phone call. And the Congresswoman Heather Wilson also called me, but she wasn't as direct, and she didn't have the political oomph to call the White House and say we want this guy gone because he's not being politically savvy. But what really nailed it, and I didn't put this in my book because I didn't know this at the time. After the book came out, I get a call in Washington D.C. when I'm living, because I went back in the Navy, and I got a call from one of Pete Domenici's assistants, and she said, I think she was intoxicated because she repeated herself a couple of times. And she's always like a dead giveaway, right? She said, "Do you know why you got fired?" I said, "Well, I have my theories. What do you think?" She goes, "You weren't looking out after the party." And I said, "Absolutely true, because that wasn't my job. My job was to prosecute bad guys and enforce federal laws. Having the party as a client was not what I was signed up for." So in the roundabout way, yeah, that entire episode unnerved me. I was out of work for 7 months. It was awful. I think all of us are used to having health insurance. I didn't have health insurance for like 6 months at that time. And you're just waiting for the shoe to drop. You're waiting for one of your kids. I had 4 little kids at that time to like break a leg on a, playground accident. It never happened, but wow. I was really nervous that something awful was going to happen, and then what happened was the beginning of the redemption, which was I got contacted by a book agent, and then all these speaking engagements rolled in. I thought to myself, is this really that big of a deal? And as time went on, I realized this had never happened. That no president had fired that many of his own U.S. attorneys. Prior years, they'd fired the last administrations, which is fine, but never their own. So we all formed this little league. We call it the Justice League, kind of like the comic book series, right? And we stayed in close contact. We testified in Congress, both in the House and the Senate on the same day. 7 different investigations launched. The Justice Department lost 12 people as a result of our testimony. I mean, it was a huge deal at the time. And my daughter said, "Dad, you're in the history books." I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Well, I just took a history class and you're in it." I'm like, "What? Really?" So yeah, it was an earth-shattering experience for somebody who thought his life was going to go one direction, and then it ended up taking a huge shift.
When you think through like all these different significant moments you've had, which there have been clearly a lot, many that people know about, probably many that people don't know anything about, what are maybe 1 or 2 really significant moments that people might not be as familiar with based on what's public knowledge or what's just been happening in your life?
Right. Well, marrying who I married made all the difference in the world because Cindy was 7 years younger than me. She hadn't finished her college education yet when I met her, and she was a risk taker. She said yes when a lot of women would said no. So when you hear about women being force multipliers, I know it's not very romantic, but it's true. A force multiplier is something that without a good result cannot happen.
Explain a little bit force multipliers for people listening. So a
force multiplier is a good military term. So for example, the jets on an aircraft carrier is a force multiplier, because what the jets do is it pushes the power out hundreds of miles, and those jets can fire missiles and take out not only ground locations but ship locations. I mean, it multiplies the inherent force that one object has. And in a similar way, I always had potential, but my wife brought that potential to bear and encouraged me to run for office, encouraged me to put in for a White House fellowship, which also put me in contact with lots of national leaders. So, yeah, had I not married her, I would have had a quiet government job in D.C., and I'd probably be counting widgets at some point. And you and I wouldn't be talking today.
Right. As when you were running for office, I mean, it's not everyone's plan to run for office. It wasn't part of your initial plan, I don't think, probably.
No.
How'd you come to that decision, and what was that journey like?
So here's what I've learned: a lot of lessons, big lessons and small lessons. But one of the bigger lessons was, if you do well in a political race, your career is not over. That positions you to run again for something else. I didn't realize that, or to be appointed to something else. So I ran for Attorney General for the state of New Mexico in 1998. I just turned 40 years old. And why did I run? There was a vacancy, so I didn't have to worry about running against an incumbent. New Mexico is overwhelmingly Democratic. I was a Republican, but I knew that state had only elected one Republican Attorney General since 1928. And I knew that because I'd worked for him. And I said, "How'd you do it, Al?" He goes, "I think it was because there was a snowstorm on the day of the election in the northern part of the state where there's high concentrations of Democrats." Because he only won by a few hundred votes.
Wow.
So I thought, this is going to be an uphill battle. But I ran, raised a ton of money, a record amount of money, and had a lot of fun. Lost a ton of weight, which is always cool, if you want to lose weight, which I did. And I was only beaten by 2 points by somebody who'd run 5 times previously.
Wow.
So I figured from that point on I had potential. And then 2 years later, Bush won, and then I put in to be U.S. Attorney, which was the federal version of what I'd run for, but with a bigger office, a bigger budget. It was like I'd run for, let's see, I'm going to give something relevant. What's a common? I'd run for a Toyota Camry, and I ended up with a Tesla or something.
Right. Wow, that's amazing. As you think through people who helped you along the way, mentors, key figures in your life, who comes to mind and why?
I can think of 2 people. Admiral Bill Payne was a friend of mine, Navy Admiral, not a JAG, he was a SEAL. But he had the best sense of humor, and he used to come in my office in Santa Fe and shout out to the top of his voice, "Iglesias, keep up the adequate work." Yeah, which was my reaction. I thought, well, Bill's here. And just his good humor and his focus and his humanity and his encouragement really, really made a difference. And then my father, who very quietly, showed me what real leadership was. He came from an indigenous background in Panama, was educated in America, pastored churches, but he was always there for me. And so dads, always be there for your kids. So drive the 6 hours to see their games, because they're going to remember that when they're 65, for example, because my dad drove 6 hours from Santa Fe to Clovis, New Mexico to watch me stand in the sidelines because I was injured that game.
Wow.
And I'll never forget that.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. When you think through that type of leadership, a lot of people listening to this podcast are going to be wondering questions about servant leadership.
Yeah.
What do you think of when you hear servant leadership?
It's funny. That phrase was something that I hadn't heard until maybe 20 years ago. And now I hear it all the time. Initially, I heard it from Christians. Now I hear it from a lot of military people who may or may not be Christians. But to me, a servant leader is someone who's not going to ask anyone to do something that he or she's not willing to do themselves, and somebody who actually does that.
That's good.
So get your hands dirty. Don't just direct by fiat. And remember, you're part of the team. And also, you're not always going to be the leader. Leaders come and go. What is more important is the mission of the organization. So what's the mission? And there are career people that are going to stay there a lot longer than you. I have people back in Albuquerque that I hired in 2001, Chris.
Wow.
It's 22 years ago.
Yeah.
And I know that because I'm still in contact with them.
That's amazing to think about. As you watch some of those people and other people, especially in politics, education, public service, how do you see people exhibit servant leadership? Any standouts?
Who is a good servant leader? Someone who is willing to get their hands dirty. Someone who's willing to keep their ego in check. And that's hard because power is so, I don't want to say just corrupting, but it indelibly marks. It's like a ink that never washes out of your soul. And power has that influence. And when you've had real power, like I've been responsible for a couple of death penalty cases. I mean, how often do you talk to somebody who can literally put somebody to death? It's massively, if your mind's not right, destabilizing. So who stands out as a good servant leader? Let me think about that. And it may be, well, I'll think back to one of my first bosses, a guy named David Campbell, who was the city attorney of Albuquerque. He put in the hours. He would never do something. He would never ask you to do something he wouldn't do. He was ethical. In fact, he's come and talked here a couple times here at Wheaton College.
Wow.
So I tend to remember people who had an influence in my life.
Wow. So speaking of Wheaton College, you've been helping students now since 2014.
Yeah, 9 years.
As you think through your career journey and what students are experiencing today, what are some similarities? What are some big differences for students who are thinking about leadership and just the future workforce of America?
Yeah, I think things are different fundamentally now in 2023 than they were in the late 70s. We had a general Judeo-Christian culture. Now, not so much. I think people are doing what's right in their own eyes, which causes problems. One thing that is the same is then and now, the students think they have their lives figured out. Ha! What a joke. Nobody has their life figured out. But you don't know that when you're 19, 20 years old. You end up, and what's always fascinating to me is talking to my students who have been out 5 or 10 years and they're doing things that they never could have conceived possible. You look at pictures of me from the 70s, and I had a huge afro, and I was Mr. Bad Attitude. I didn't do ROTC. I remember getting into an argument with a federal judge. I didn't know he was a federal judge, who was a West Point grad. I was arguing that military schools are outdated because of nuclear weapons, and we really got into it. I would never take that position now because I've actually been in the military for a long time. So yeah, it's been a real journey. I think it's harder now to graduate from Wheaton and make a difference for several reasons. I think the pervasiveness of social media, we didn't have to worry about that. I think the culture has shifted so that now students have to be careful what they say in a way that we really didn't. But having said that, Wheaton grads are still doing great things. I mean, I bring them as part of my center all the time.
Yeah. As you think through challenges that people are facing, especially people who are going to be watching this podcast, probably well-meaning and potentially high potential leaders, it's tough to have a balancing act of work life, personal life, maybe other areas of life that matter to people. How did you, throughout your career, balance? Did you balance well? And what advice would you give to people?
You'd have to ask my wife that question.
What would she say?
I think she would say that, yes, that generally speaking, especially in more recent years, my life is more balanced. When you're in your 20s and 30s, your education is right behind you, but all that knowledge is fresh. You want to go as far as you can in that organization or in that field, and you're willing to put in the hours. But at some point, I'll say in your 30s, when you have a few kids, you realize, I just missed my daughter's birthday because of that deal I was working. And then when you're a little bit older, you feel guilty about it, but you're willing to do it again. Then a few years later, you realize, I'm never going to get that back. And at some point, if you have a conscience, you realize that sacrifice wasn't worth it. And you start doing things so you don't have to work on weekends. I have a nephew who works weekends, evenings. Every time I see him, it looks worse. You know, he became a lawyer because of me. I feel a little bit responsible because he became a lawyer because of me. And, he's got he's earned more money than I've ever earned. But I think he's also not enjoyed law as much as I have. When my students say, and I have one student I'm thinking of right now who is in law school, he's clerk for a federal judge, he's going to do great things. But he almost got talked out of it by his uncle, who said, lawyers are miserable people and you shouldn't go to law school. So the student comes up to me and says, what do you think of that? I said, well, where does he work? Well, he works for a giant firm, right? I said, you should have talked to guys like me who have been in public service. Yeah, we've earned a fraction of what they've earned, but so what? We have weekends off and holidays off. We have a life. We have vacations. Imagine that. And we don't have, 3 vacations home, but they don't spend time in those homes because they're working. So at some point in your career, you've got to decide what's more important, to have balance or to ring the brass bell and, make millions or billions now. Making a lot of money was never important to me. And that, I think, was foundational to me trying to live a life of balance. Also, the Navy encouraged being physically fit. So for 30 years, I had to be tested every 6 months. Running, push-ups, sit-ups, now it's planking, swimming. And I had to keep my weight under a certain amount. That discipline applies across the board.
Wow. So
I feel very obligated, to the service for helping me learn that life lesson when I was 26 years old.
It was interesting, even just watching the movie, being reminded of just how intense some of the military service is. Whether it's Navy, Army, Air Force, Coast Guard, whatever. Thinking through what they go through. As a JAG officer, were you going through all of the exact same training? And how is that different than the other people who are serving?
Oh, well, that's a very good question, Chris. In my mind, the least painful way to become a naval officer is to be a lawyer, a doctor, a dentist, and to go through officer development school, because you're commissioned first and then you go. So you don't have sweaty Marine drill instructors screaming in your ears like my daughter is experiencing right now in Newport, Rhode Island, because she's doing it the hard way. She's going through officer candidate school. So she has to prove her mettle.
Got it.
That's the hardest way. Although arguably, being at the Naval Academy or Military Academy, Air Force Academy for 4 years is also very hard, but it's not as concentrated as that 12-week period. And then if you're enlisted, It's not easy because for the first time you're hearing people screaming at high volumes, no, you're not special. And they're breaking you down. Because the culture has changed so that everybody's special, everybody gets a ribbon, and to which the military would say, baloney. And one of the best things that the military did for me was help keep my ego in check, because as the only son and the youngest of 3 children, I was indulged. The military doesn't care about that. It cares about achieving the mission, training you to be an ethical, competent, professional lawyer. And I would like to think that it did that job.
What do you think about that leadership style that you're talking about, how so many cadets or future cadets go through compared to leadership that you might see in business? What crossover is there? What lessons can people learn looking at the military about leadership and servant leadership?
I think some of the best lessons or some of the best leaders come from the military, because they've had to learn those hard lessons that maybe if you go to business school you don't learn, because it's all about doing well in school and earning a lot of getting the right job and coming up with a great idea and then pushing it forward. There's no rite of passage in the same way as the military, where they break you down, as my youngest daughter's finding out, and then build you right back up. She had to earn the right to use the computer. She had to earn the right to get her cell phone back, which she's not had her cell phone now for 2 months. It'll be another week or 2 until she gets her cell phone back.
Wow.
When was the last time you heard of somebody voluntarily giving up their cell phone?
I can't think of a time.
For 10 weeks? Or, yeah. I mean,
even 1 week would be crazy, yeah.
I mean, some people couldn't do it for more than an hour or so. So all that to say that I think service leadership servant leadership really has flourished in the military, because you see leaders who are getting their hands dirty, who are working the hours with you, who are running, who are in the weight room with you, who are acting honorably, who are being ethical. So they're not just talking about ethics, they're actually showing it.
Right. Wow. This has been fascinating. As you think through all the different life lessons that you've learned, is there any key takeaway that you hope, I mean, you've already shared some about being present with your kids, about how to treat other people, any others that you think is worth sharing with people based on things you've learned in your own life?
Yeah, this is really hard. It's going to be a very simple statement, but it'll be extremely hard to do. Try to practice being others-oriented. So put the needs of other people first. Easy to say, hard to practice. But if you are empathetic, you'll do well in life. One of the things that they don't teach you in business school or law school or medical school is people with high EQ do better than people with high IQ. I can't tell you how many really smart, really credentialed people work for me. People went to the top 5 or 10 law schools in the country, which I did not go to. But I ended up getting the job because I could listen, I could treat them respectfully, I could disagree respectfully. Those are life skills. And sadly, in many parts of our country, we've lost that. Again, I hold social media largely responsible, and I'm not on social media for that reason. I know myself, and I don't trust myself. I would never put myself out on Facebook or Twitter, especially. Speed is not always the best thing. Sometimes quiet, slow contemplation is better. So that's something else that I've learned. The world is not always entitled to your opinion. So I hope that generally answers your questions.
No, that's great. We finish all interviews here with 10 rapid fire questions in 60 seconds. So I'm just going to ask a few questions, and you just say the first thing that comes to your mind.
Sure.
If needs more than 1 or 2 words, that's fine. But first person you think of when I say servant leadership?
George H.W. Bush.
That's a good one. 5 words to describe yourself.
Blessed, unicorn, misunderstood, optimistic, physically fit.
Wow. I feel like with both those first two, I feel like we should do a whole nother podcast episode. Favorite author or book?
Fiction or nonfiction?
You choose.
For fiction, Norman Maclean, A River Runs Through It, and other short stories. I read it every year.
Wow.
For nonfiction, let me say Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond.
Okay. Wow. Favorite movie?
That would be Chariots of Fire.
Okay. That's great.
Number 2 is The Way, which is being re-released tomorrow for one day.
Really?
That's what I was watching when you got me in my office.
Oh, wow. I'm going to need to look at that. Yeah. Favorite food?
Mexican.
Okay. Favorite thing to do in your free time?
Run or swim or lift.
Surprising fact about you?
That's a hard one. Surprising. That I like to write poetry.
Wow.
Yeah.
Have you used any of the AI to help write poetry?
Heck
or
no.
just try?
Computers have no soul.
Okay. Okay. That's fair. Favorite place you've been?
Machu Picchu.
Oh, wow. That'd be awesome. Place that you want to visit that you have not visited before?
Petra. But that's going to be fixed in a month.
Wow. That'll be amazing. Best advice you've ever gotten?
The best advice I've ever gotten is take the long view. Everything you do of its significance should be thought of in generational terms, multi-generations. The Iroquois would say up to 7 generations. I can't even think that far, but that's what they thought.
Why do you think people don't do that as much now?
Oh, because Americans, we value speed, expediency. We don't think of consequence, because if we can get it done, we'll build that building. What did Joni Mitchell say? We'll pave over paradise and put up a parking lot. That's absolutely true.
Wow. This I don't ask this to everybody because those were the 10 rapid fire, but last one. Did you end up meeting Tom Cruise, who played you in A Few Good Men?
No.
You didn't? Okay.
I wish.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I know viewers will really enjoy hearing your perspective, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Servant Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss an update. Be sure to check out the servantleadershippodcast.org for more updates and additional bonus content.